Hey everyone, on this episode of the Speak Easies,
History is whatever we say it is.
I got a little space in my heart for Denmark.
The children in the rice paddies would have water up to their chins.
I don't know about you guys, but I had been keeping up with the World Cup, and we don't need to talk about the results, but I don't know about you guys, but one of the big things that I noticed, or not noticed, but I thought of, was that you have all these different countries, of course, from around the world, and one of the things I was thinking was like, how did they get the names of their countries? Like, I'm talking way back when, because some of these countries are hundreds of years old. And so I did exactly what, I would do. And I spent time researching the etymology of various countries' names. So without further ado, let's just dive right in. In honor of France winning, we're going to start off with them. And it's pretty simple. I mean, a lot of these nations are pretty simple. You guys have any idea of what France would be? You have any guesses before? Maybe that's how we should do it. Like, you guys have any guesses of what the names would mean?
Okay, guesses as to what? Like the name,
So, like,
what it means?
like
Sorry.
France? Like, do you have any idea what France is from? The name?
Um, it's funny because I took French for 2 years, but I have no idea. Actually, wait. Yes, I do. Franks.
It's
Is it
That's right.
Franks? Because that is the
So,
people. All right, nailed it.
so after the fall of Rome, the the land of France was sort of this contested region, and the Franks were a Germanic tribe that ultimately conquered the region. So, you take the place, you take the name.
That's
And so
that
that's
is
a
how
pretty
it
simple
is.
one. And
There you go.
a lot of nations are named after their their people, of course. It's like Botswana. That
The
name,
Botswana people.
it literally translates to the land of the Swana,
Hmm.
and that's another group that's pretty predominant in the region there. But going across the channel from France, there's England, and England is an interesting country because they have a few names. England, of course, there's England, and that's named yet again after the people, the land of the Anglo Saxons, Anglo land, England. But then there's Britain, which translates to Great Land of the Tattooed. Um, it comes
What?
from the Greek word pretonoi. I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but and the Celtic word Brit, meaning light colored. And so when the Romans came, they like, oh, these Celtic people are covered with tattoos, because that was what they did back then. The Celtic people, a lot of them had tattoos over their body. So so yeah, that's what Britain comes from, tattooed, the land of the tattooed. And what you may not know is that England has a name that it used to be called, named Albion, and that is yet again another Roman word for albus, which means white, and it might be referring to like the White Cliffs of Dover. Interesting, huh? At least to me.
Well,
um,
personally, um, I think if we just called England Albion, that would be way cooler.
it is
Because
way
we as
cooler.
Americans, we could have rebelled from the kingdom of Albion. And now, how cool would that be? Right? Like, that makes me think of swords. It just does. Like, American Revolution, swords, instantly 10 times
Honestly,
cooler. Albion, like 2.5 times cooler. That's like a total compounding that. That's like 25 times cooler. It really is.
honestly. Speaking of America, um, America, as some of you may know, is named after the explorer Amerigo Vespucci. What happened was, uh, Amerigo went on a trip to um, Trinidad and Tobago, that area, um, South America, and he took notes, of course, and he wrote letters. And sometime later, those letters were published, and some German people were thought they wanted to include that in this book they were publishing, but they misinterpreted it and they thought that Amerigo Vespucci was the one that um, quote unquote discovered America instead of Columbus. I say quotes because you know that's not really the case. But anyway, they thought that Amerigo Vespucci was credited with that. So they said, he discovered this. Why don't we name it after him? He deserves it, right? And so because of that interpretation error, 2 continents are named after this man. Kind of interesting, right? Typos, man. Typos. I mean, what's I thought was kind of interesting was the most interesting one of all my studies was China. Do you guys have any ideas about China? Take some guesses. If you're familiar with Chinese history, you might have a good idea of what it comes from.
Polo, why don't you take this one?
I'm not Chinese.
I know, but it's just I've already talked and you've been silent, so.
Well, I was going to say at first it was from the Europeans, but then I thought that's wrong. Now, I'm going to pretend like I know history here.
All right.
So, I believe it started when the people that inhabited China were gathering rice, which as we know is abundant there. And you know how they're in rice paddies. The children in the rice paddies would have water up to their chins. Thus, they named the area China.
You
What?
should have stuck with your European guess because
Okay.
I think this one's better. Honestly, I do.
So, if you're not familiar with Chinese history, what you may not know is
As
that
I am.
there have been several dynasties in China. One of which is the Qin dynasty, and it's debated, but a lot of people believe that the word China comes from a romanization of Qin dynasty. But it doesn't end
So
there.
named, of course, because the children in the rice paddies had water up to their chins, as Polo had said.
Well, the problem is that Qin is spelled with a Q. So,
Well,
and I don't think that.
Listen,
I don't think that there's
history
a
is
word-
whatever we say it is.
That's
we will
right.
never know the truth.
That's right.
But here's why I thought it was interesting because there's actually a different word for China in the actual language. I know there's several Chinese languages, but I think it's Mandarin where they refer to China as, and excuse my pronunciation, but Changhua is how they say China.
You're excused.
I may have said that wrong, and that's sort of important. But what it translates to is the Middle Kingdom, and that's also contested because some people say it's because the Chinese civilization way back when viewed themselves as the center of the world, like a lot of civilizations do. But other people say that it was referring to the Yellow River Valley, which is where the Zhou dynasty was centered. Totally different dynasty, but fun fact, the Zhou dynasty was, and I might be totally messing that up by the way, but that was the longest dynasty in Chinese history.
So, quick question. Are you saying that China before was, in the Roman times, at least, China was not actually named anything? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think what happened was they sort of referred to themselves as whatever dynasty was ruling them. I think. I'm not too familiar with Chinese history.
So, like, if I was in the Roman Empire times, we would just call the area of China the land of the Qin. Is how I am
When I say,
interpreting this?
hold on, when I say Romanization, I think I just mean language wise.
Okay.
Because I believe the Qin dynasty was far after the Roman empire had fallen. In fact, the Qin dynasty was, oh no, actually it's around the same time. It was like 2200s, like 221 BC. That's what I just saw. But so yeah, I mean, I think they probably referred to it as maybe like the land of Qin, and eventually it just sort of molded into China.
I have a personal theory,
All right,
which I'm not gonna bother to look up. I'm gonna leave that to our viewers because part of us wants to encourage research and new knowledge and understanding things. But here's my personal theory, because going off of Europe, I know so many different ethnic groups inhabited Europe, and they would just name the areas in which they lived, like, land of the Franks, or land of the Anglo-Saxons, and like Lithuania, since I have a special uh, relation. Lithuania has a special place in my heart. They were known as the Kingdom of Lithuania at one time, the largest kingdom in Europe. Just wanted to throw that in, humble brag for Lithuania, my man. But Lithu sorry, China is such a big spot of land. I feel like before it was completely condensed, you know, under one central rule or something, and the Qin dynasty or the Qin dynasty, it's so big that there would have to be so many different ethnic groups within that land, and they would just each know their own land as like the land of, let's say, the Qin, or the land of some other thing. And I guess the outsiders would know it by that way as well. The Romans going along the Silk Road, right?
for sure, for sure. In fact, one of the, um, I think there are like five predominant cultural groups in China, and one of the flags of China once had like five colors to represent those. But for sure, there's definitely a very large cultural diversity in the nation of China. But you know what, the I think the China was the most interesting. But you know what the most complex was for me in my research?
What?
Egypt. I was reading about it, and it's just so, just listen. So the word Egypt comes from the French word Egypt. Okay, that's pretty easy. But then you wonder, that doesn't really answer the question. That's just another translation, right? Well, that comes from the Greek word Aegyptos, and still, we don't really, that doesn't really give you much. That means the Nile River, Egypt. But once again, we're still at that point. It's like, what does Egypt mean? Well, Egypt comes from the Amarna language, which is an ancient Egyptian language, which the word Egypt comes from Haikupta, which refers to a temple in Memphis, not Memphis, Tennessee.
It's
Uh,
like, we got
you know,
temples there? Man, America's cooler than I thought.
Memphis was a big city in ancient Egypt, and so it refers to a temple in Memphis, Egypt. And I was like, seriously, I was going through translation to translation to translation, and it's just, I don't know. That was interesting,
But
but it was also
ano-
a
another
bit
quick
much.
question then, what is the significance of the temple then? Do you know?
Well, I think it's not necessarily the significance of the temple per se. I think Memphis was, I don't know if it was the capital of Egypt, but it was definitely a big city in Egypt. And I believe at the time there was a greater emphasis on religion and temples. So they would probably credit, when they refer to something, they'd probably refer to it as, um, whatever god it was
Oh,
honoring. Like Athens, for example, that clearly comes from Athena, you know. So I think there is a much closer connection to religious symbols back then. So
Yeah,
that's my guess.
yeah, and I don't know much about Egyptian gods, but maybe, what was it? Ayupta or
It
something? What
was
did you say?
Haik. Excuse me. It
Hai
was,
Haikupta?
yes, Haikupta.
Haikupta. Maybe Haikupta was an ancient Egyptian god, and some explorer, or they forgot over the long years, over the oral tradition, they forgot the gods that they used to worship. But it just, is showing itself now in the name of the country. That would be interesting.
Yeah. You know, so some of these are pretty simple. Like Sweden. That comes from the name. That comes from the Swedes, like a tribe. There's another way to translate it, like in their traditional language, but I just I don't want to mess up so many pronunciations in one episode, so I'll just say the Swedes because that's what it essentially is. But then there's Denmark, which is I got a little space in my heart for Denmark, but that's beyond the point. But that name is pretty debated. I was going in thinking that it was just going to be related to the Danes, like some sort of tribe of some sort. But it turns out that it's very well debated as to what Denmark means. One theory is that it refers to the Danish March, where a bunch of Danish soldiers were protecting their land. There might have been some conquering involved in that, but I'm not too familiar with the Danish March. It was in the Middle Ages. That's all I know. Um, Another theory, which is sort of interesting, is that one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel settled there because one of the tribes is called Dan. So they think
Weren't
that
there 12 of those?
um
I thought Israel was 12 tribes. Forgive me if I'm wrong.
I it's 10 or 12.
Oh,
I know.
well,
I This is sort of
please look this up again if you're
yeah.
listening.
Yeah.
Tell
But
us in the comments. Feel better
one of
about
the
yourself.
Just remember, we are not historians
for
yet.
sure.
There it is.
And so the other two theories, I'll sort of wrap this up because I'm taking a look at the time here, but they think that it relates to the mythological King Dan of the Danes, and also Dan means low ground in the Danish language, and Mark means woods or forest. So they think it's sort of a mix of those. But there's all kinds of theories. So yeah, kind of interesting.
Man, history is fascinating. It really is.
It is for people who are interested in history.
Well, I don't think it's just for those who are interested in history, but it also makes people interested in history. So, with that, it looks like we're coming up on our limit of time. Thanks for listening to this episode, and make sure to come back in a couple of days for the next one.